Ever look up at the night sky and just wonder what it all means? Like, is there some bigger purpose to it all?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're tackling in today's deep dive.
Ooh, exciting.
We're going to be exploring philosopher Philip Goff's book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe.
You know, it's funny because pretty much everyone asks themselves these huge questions at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's it all about?
Yeah.
What's the point of existence? Is there one?
Right. And Goff really tries to dig into that, using both philosophy and science.
That's a pretty big undertaking.
Oh, yeah. To guide our deep dive, we're going to follow the structure of Goff's book. He starts by looking at the whole concept of meaning, which is a good place to start, I think.
Makes sense.
You know, daily life can feel so random and chaotic.
Yeah.
It's like you spill your coffee, you miss your bus.
Totally.
Does any of it matter in the grand scheme of things?
Right.
Goff starts by acknowledging that feeling, that kind of like suspicion that maybe it's all just a cosmic accident.
Oh, absolutely.
If there's no overall plan, you know, like some divine blueprint or something,
Right.
are our lives just these random blips that don't really mean anything?
That's a heavy thought.
It is. And Goff even mentions the philosopher David Benatar, who has a pretty, I guess you could call it, bleak view of things.
Yeah, Benatar's not known for his sunny disposition.
No. He basically argues that from a cosmic perspective, human life might seem pretty insignificant. He makes this analogy of children arguing over a ball.
Okay.
Like, to them, it's this huge deal.
Right.
But to anyone else observing, it's just kids being kids.
It's all about perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that cosmic insignificance feels particularly relevant today, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Goff talks about this sense of, well, kind of a twinge of guilt that some people feel about bringing children into the world.
Right. Especially with all the problems we are facing, like climate change.
Exactly. Like, what kind of future are we leaving them?
It's a big question. But then Goff shifts gears a little and introduces this more hopeful idea from a thinker named Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, interesting.
Teilhard de Chardin suggests that maybe evolution isn't just a random series of mutations, but that it actually has a direction, like a movement toward greater complexity and, importantly, consciousness.
So it's not just random change, but change with a direction, a purpose.
That's the idea.
I like that.
Right. So our actions might not be just random events, but could actually be a part of this massive evolutionary process.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. So we're all part of something much bigger, something unfolding over vast stretches of time.
Yeah, potentially. It's a pretty huge shift in how we view ourselves, isn't it?
For sure. And it leads to a pretty personal question for everyone listening.
Oh, really?
Does the idea of cosmic significance resonate with you?
Mm-hmm.
Would believing in a universe with some kind of inherent purpose change how you live your life?
Right.
Or, can we find meaning right here, right now in our everyday lives, even if our individual lives are just a tiny blip on the cosmic timeline?
That's the question. What feels truer to you?
Yeah. What matters more to you?
Those are the kinds of questions Goff wants us to grapple with. And then he moves on to another question. Is meaning ultimately subjective?
Ah, interesting.
Is it just a personal feeling, or are there objective standards of value that exist, like, regardless of how we feel?
That's a tricky one.
It is. To illustrate this, he gives this really interesting thought experiment about a woman named Susan. Susan dedicates her entire life to counting every single blade of grass.
Okay, a very focused individual.
Right. And she finds this pursuit deeply meaningful.
Good for Susan.
Right. But then Goff asks, is Susan's goal objectively worthwhile?
Right.
Does it have value beyond just her own personal satisfaction?
So it comes down to whether there's something inherently valuable about counting blades of grass, or if it's just meaningful to her because she decided it was. That's the core issue. Subjective feeling versus objective value.
It's a real head-scratcher.
It is.
Because on the one hand, who are we to judge what should give someone else meaning?
Live and let live, right?
Right. But then on the other hand, some goals just feel inherently more worthwhile than others.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, I think most people would agree that, say, alleviating suffering is a better use of time than, I don't know, organizing pebbles by color.
Right, exactly. And Goff doesn't want to be like the meaning police, dictating what makes a good life, you know?
Right. We don't want a universal meaning rulebook.
No. But he still thinks it's important to consider whether some paths might be objectively better than others.
Okay. So we have to acknowledge people's individual sense of meaning, but also be open to the idea that some pursuits might be objectively more valuable.
Exactly. So how do we even begin to figure that out? What makes something objectively good or bad?
Good question. It's a big one.
It is a huge question. And it leads us to the next part of Goff's exploration, which is where he dives into the scientific evidence for purpose in the universe.
Okay, so we're getting into the science now.
We are. Specifically, he looks at what's called the fine-tuning argument.
The fine-tuning.
Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I've come across it before. It's the idea that the universe is incredibly precisely calibrated for life to exist.
Exactly. Like the strength of gravity or the electromagnetic force, all these fundamental constants of physics, if they were even slightly different.
Right?
Life as we know it, or maybe any life at all, wouldn't be possible.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Oh, yeah. And the odds of this happening purely by chance, well, they're astronomical, to put it mildly.
Yeah, we're talking winning the lottery multiple times in a row kind of odds.
That's a good way to put it. Goff uses this analogy. Imagine winning a lottery, then getting struck by lightning, then winning the lottery again, all in the same day.
Wow, okay. That's some serious luck.
That's how improbable it is for the universe to be so precisely tuned for life just by random chance.
So it seems like there must be something else going on.
Right. It's such a huge coincidence that it makes you wonder if it's a coincidence at all.
Makes sense. So if it's not just random chance,
Yeah.
what other explanations are there?
Well, one option, and Goff acknowledges this, is just dumb luck. It was a cosmic fluke of unbelievable proportions.
Okay. But that doesn't seem very satisfying, does it?
No, not really. But Goff has another, more interesting possibility, which he calls the value selection hypothesis.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What's that?
This hypothesis basically says that value itself, like some kind of inherent tendency towards life and consciousness, might have actually shaped the universe and its laws.
So it's not just that the universe happened to be right for life, but that life was somehow baked into the universe from the beginning.
That's the basic idea.
I mean, that's a pretty big departure from how we usually think about science, right?
It is. Science is all about objective observation, things we can measure and test.
Yeah. It's not really about abstract concepts like value or purpose.
Right. But Goff reminds us that science has had to go through these big shifts in thinking before.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe.
Right. That was a big deal back then.
It was a huge deal. And it took a major shift in thinking to accept that the Earth actually revolved around the sun.
So maybe we need a similar shift now to understand this fine-tuning.
That's what Goff is suggesting.
Okay, that's a pretty bold claim. So how do we even start to evaluate evidence like this?
Yeah, how do we weigh pure chance against this value selection idea?
Right. How do we decide which is more likely?
Well, this is where a concept called the likelihood principle comes in.
The likelihood principle. What's that?
It's basically a way to assess which of two competing ideas is better supported by the evidence we have.
Okay. So it's a tool to help us figure out which explanation is more probable.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're walking on a beach and you find a bunch of pebbles arranged to spell out the word hello.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
What would you think?
Well, my first thought would be that someone intentionally arranged those pebbles.
Right. You wouldn't think the waves just happened to do that by chance?
The way.
Because that specific arrangement is way more likely if someone did it on purpose.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just not a very likely outcome if it were random chance.
Exactly. That's the likelihood principle in action. We see something specific and we ask, which explanation makes this observation less surprising?
So applying that back to the fine-tuning argument,
Yeah.
those incredibly precise values of the physical constants, that's like our hello message on the cosmic beach.
In a way, yes, those precise values are much more likely if the value selection hypothesis is true, if there's something pushing the universe towards life.
Right. It's more probable than if it was all just a random accident.
Exactly. And this leads to the idea of credence, which is basically how confident we are in a belief.
Okay, so our credence in, say, the value selection hypothesis would be higher if we use the likelihood principle.
Right, because the evidence, the fine-tuning, makes that hypothesis seem more likely. And the likelihood principle gives us a way to update our credence as we learn more. It's a way to be more logical about our beliefs.
I like that. It's a way to think about how we form our own opinions, not just about the universe, but about everything.
Totally.
So we've got this fine-tuning argument, which is a pretty compelling piece of evidence for purpose, right?
Yeah. And Goff presents another major piece of evidence that I find even more mind-boggling. The existence of consciousness.
Consciousness, our own awareness.
Yeah. How does that point to a purposeful universe? I'm really curious to hear this.
Well, Goff uses a thought experiment called the meaning zombie to illustrate this point.
Okay, meaning zombie. This sounds interesting.
It is. Imagine a being that looks and acts exactly like a human being.
Okay, got it.
It can talk, it can walk, it can laugh, it can cry, everything.
So like a perfect copy of a human.
Right. But here's the key difference. The meaning zombie has no inner experience, no feelings, no thoughts, no subjective awareness of what it's doing.
It's basically like a really sophisticated robot, perfectly mimicking human behavior,
Exactly.
but with nothing going on inside.
Right, just a shell.
So if consciousness evolved purely for survival, like a lot of scientists believe,
Right.
wouldn't a meaning zombie be just as successful as a conscious human?
Yeah, totally. It could still function, it could reproduce, it could navigate the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why did consciousness evolve at all then?
That's the big question.
Yeah, why aren't we all just meaning zombies? If consciousness is just a byproduct, a side effect of evolution, why is it there at all?
Right, it doesn't seem necessary for survival.
And this leads Goff to suggest that consciousness might be more fundamental than we think.
So it's not just a helpful adaptation, but something deeper, something more essential to the universe.
That's the idea. Really unsettling thought.
It is. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality.
Yeah. And it leads Goff to explore a concept called panpsychism.
Panpsychism.
Have you heard of this?
I have. It's a pretty radical idea, right?
It is. It basically suggests that consciousness isn't something that just magically appears in complex brains,
Okay.
but rather it's a fundamental property of the universe, present in some form, even in things we usually think of as inanimate.
Like rocks and trees and stuff.
Yeah, even rocks and trees, even individual particles.
Wow. It's a big leap.
It is. It means that my brain doesn't create consciousness, but rather it taps into this consciousness that's already there, woven into the fabric of reality.
So we're all connected to this universal consciousness in some way.
That's the basic idea.
It's a pretty wild thought,
Yeah,
but it's hard to dismiss it completely, especially when you consider the mystery of consciousness.
exactly. It opens up a whole new way of understanding our place in the universe.
It does. So we've got the fine-tuning argument, and we've got the existence of consciousness, both pointing towards the possibility of purpose.
Right. And the next logical step is to ask, well, does this mean there's a God?
The big G word.
Yeah. If there's a purpose, does that imply a purpose giver?
A designer, a creator.
Right. And Goff tackles this head on.
Okay, how does he approach that?
He doesn't shy away from the tough questions. He looks at the traditional attributes of God. You know, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good.
Right, the classic definition.
Exactly. And he examines whether those attributes really fit with the world as we experience it.
Because there's a lot of stuff that doesn't seem very godlike, right?
Yeah. And of course, he brings up the problem of evil.
Right.
How can an all-powerful, perfectly good God create a world with so much suffering?
It's a question that's troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries.
Oh, yeah. And Goff looks at all these attempts to reconcile God's goodness with the existence of evil. These are called theodicies.
Okay, so like explanations for why a good God would allow bad things to happen.
Right. But ultimately, Goff doesn't find them convincing, especially given the sheer amount of suffering in the world.
Yeah. It's hard to reconcile that suffering with the idea of an all-loving God.
So does this mean Goff completely rejects the idea of a designer?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
He's open to the possibility of some kind of cosmic designer, some kind of guiding intelligence,
Okay.
but maybe not the traditional God we often imagine.
So not necessarily the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God.
Right. He considers other possibilities.
Like what?
Like maybe a limited designer, one that's not all-powerful and maybe working within constraints we don't fully understand.
That's an interesting idea. A designer that's maybe bound by certain limitations?
Right, like maybe there are rules of the universe that even a designer has to follow.
And that could explain why things aren't always perfect.
Exactly. It's a way to account for the messiness of reality.
And what other ideas does Goff entertain?
Well, he even brings up the simulation hypothesis.
Oh, wow, the simulation hypothesis. That's a wild one.
It is. It's the idea that our universe might actually be a simulation created by some highly advanced beings.
Like we're all just characters in a giant video game.
It sounds crazy, but some serious thinkers have actually proposed it as a real possibility.
Right, and Goff even acknowledges that.
He does. He's willing to explore even these seemingly outlandish ideas.
It's pretty refreshing, actually.
It is.
You don't often see that kind of openness in these kinds of discussions.
Right. So we've got the limited designer, we've got the simulation hypothesis. Any other possibilities he throws out there?
Oh, yeah. He also mentions this idea of teleologios.
Teleologicals, what are those?
They're basically like inherent laws of nature that could be subtly guiding the universe towards certain outcomes.
Okay.
So think of it like this. There's a built-in tendency towards greater complexity in consciousness. Not because of some conscious designer making choices, but because that's just how the universe works.
So it's like the universe has a direction,
Yeah.
but there's not necessarily a driver.
Exactly. And this connects back to that idea from Teilhard de Chardin about evolution having a direction.
Right. So maybe it's not just biological evolution that has a direction, but the whole universe.
That's the suggestion. Okay, so we've looked at all these different possibilities for how there might be a purpose to the universe.
Right. A lot to think about.
But what does this mean for us, for how we should live our lives? If there is a purpose, how should we respond to it?
Right, that's the key question. How do we actually put these ideas into practice?
And this is where Goff talks about spiritual advancement.
Okay, spiritual advancement. What's he mean by that?
He argues that if the universe is striving towards greater consciousness and value,
Right.
then it makes sense that we should be striving for those things too.
Makes sense. So, like, how do we do that?
He mentions specific practices like meditation, engaging with art, and even, responsibly exploring psychedelics.
Oh, interesting.
He sees these as potential tools for expanding our consciousness.
Okay. Like breaking free from our usual ways of experiencing the world.
Right. And maybe tapping into a deeper level of awareness. He even compares this to what artists do.
Oh, how so?
He says true art often challenges our norms, pushes the boundaries of how we see things.
Right. It makes you think differently.
Exactly. And he thinks practices like meditation can do the same thing.
Interesting parallel.
It is. And while he emphasizes that these practices should be approached responsibly, he sees them as valuable ways to grow spiritually and connect with something larger than ourselves.
So it's about aligning ourselves with that universal striving.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And he also talks about the importance of spiritual communities.
Oh, interesting.
He shares some of his own experiences of finding meaning and connection in a religious community,
Okay.
even though he didn't necessarily agree with all the beliefs.
Right. So it was more about the shared sense of purpose, the community aspect.
Exactly. And he thinks that can offer a lot of support as we try to grapple with these big questions.
It's like having a group of people on the same journey with you.
Yeah. And Goff also extends this idea of striving for something bigger beyond personal practices.
Okay. Where does he take it?
He connects it to how we organize our societies, particularly our economic system.
Interesting.
He challenges the idea of absolute property rights.
Okay. So the idea that we have a complete and total right to everything we own.
Right. He argues that this is a social construct, a set of agreements we've made as a society.
Okay.
And that this belief in absolute property rights can actually hinder social justice.
Interesting point. So it's not just about individual spiritual growth, but about creating a more just and compassionate world.
Exactly. He's prompting us to think about what kind of systems would best serve a universe that's moving towards greater consciousness and value.
That's a really powerful challenge to how we usually think about things.
It is. It makes you question a lot of our assumptions about how society should function.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Oh, we have. From the nature of meaning to fine-tuning, panpsychism, the problem of evil.
A whirlwind tour of the big questions.
It is. How does Goff tie it all together? What are his final thoughts?
Well, he comes back to the two main pieces of evidence. The fine-tuned universe and the existence of consciousness.
Right.
He says that together, these suggest a very different picture of reality than the one we often get from a purely materialistic worldview.
Yeah, that's a good point. The materialistic view says it's all just atoms and particles bumping around randomly.
Right. No deeper meaning or purpose.
But Goff is suggesting that there might be something more to it than that.
That the universe might be striving towards something, towards greater consciousness, greater value.
Exactly. And he leaves us with the big question. If that's true, what is it?
And how do we fit into that grand scheme?
Right. And does he give us any concrete answers?
Well, not exactly. He doesn't give a definitive answer or a set of instructions to follow.
Okay.
Instead, he emphasizes that this is an ongoing process. He wants us to keep asking these questions, to keep exploring these ideas, and to keep grappling with what they mean for our own lives.
So it's not about finding all the answers, but about being on that journey of discovery.
Exactly. He sees spiritual growth as a process of evolving, of expanding our consciousness, not about reaching some final destination.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some practical ways we can do that?
He suggests a bunch of different paths: meditation, reflection, connecting with art and beauty, finding community.
Right, and being open to new experiences, challenging our assumptions.
Exactly. It's about being active in our search for meaning and being willing to step outside our comfort zones.
He makes it clear that there's no one right way to do this,
Right. It's a very individual journey.
and that by becoming more conscious, more connected to this deeper reality, we might start to see our own lives, even our small actions, as part of something much bigger.
I like that. It's a really hopeful message.
It is. It makes you feel like even in this vast and often confusing universe, our lives can have meaning and purpose.
It's a powerful thought.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Philip Goff's Why? The Purpose of the Universe.
Wow, that was a lot.
It was. And if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I definitely recommend checking out the book. It's a really fascinating read.
I second that.
And as you go about your day, your week, your life, just remember to keep asking those big questions. Why are we here? What's it all about?
Right. Don't be afraid to question, to explore, to seek meaning.
Because the answers, as Goff suggests, might just surprise you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring the universe and keep exploring yourselves.
See you next time.